Harrow, New Mexico, 1879. A man named Cole drags an Apache woman through the saloon doors and throws her against the bar in front of 30 men. Nobody moves. Her name is Nady. She rode 30 miles alone to find a document that would stop her entire community from being thrown off their land. She found it. Now the man who needs it destroyed has her by the arm. Then a cowboy named James stands up from the corner. He has been in Harrow less than 4 hours. He does not know Nady, he does not know about the document, but he spent 6 years living alongside Apache communities, and Cole is about to find out what that means.
Before this story goes any further, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever watched someone need help and felt the pull to stand up, and then looked around and realized you were the only one feeling it? And if you are new here, subscribe now, because this channel exists for exactly that moment.
Harrow, New Mexico had the particular quality of a town that had made its accommodations with the way things were and had stopped examining those accommodations too carefully. It sat at the edge of the high desert, with one main street and the usual arrangement of buildings that frontier towns produced when function mattered more than appearance: a saloon, a boarding house, a general store, a county office, a livery at the far end, where the smell was honest and the company was quieter than most. James Calloway had ridden in 4 hours before Thursday noon for supplies and had noticed 2 things on the way in that he would not have noticed if 6 years of Army scouting had not made noticing things the permanent background condition of how he moved through the world. The first was that the road into Harrow from the east had wagon tracks fresher than the morning. Heavy wagons, multiple horses, the kind of outfit that a federal inspection party traveled in. The second was that those wagons were camped 2 miles east of town in a flat spot beside the creek, where the grass was good and the sight lines were long. He had filed both observations in the part of his mind where useful things went, and had continued into Harrow and tied his horse at the general store and gone inside to buy what he came for. He was in the saloon afterward with a cup of coffee and no particular urgency when the doors came open. The man who came through them was large in the way that men are large when size has been useful to them professionally and they have leaned into it. Broad across the shoulders, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who has learned that the space he occupies tends to expand to whatever he needs it to be. His name was Cole, and James did not know that yet, but he knew the type immediately. The way you know a type when you have spent years in territories where certain types appear regularly, doing certain kinds of work for certain kinds of men. Cole had a woman by the arm. She was Apache. James could see that in the first second, in the specific structure of her face and the way she was dressed, and the particular quality of stillness she was maintaining, despite being dragged through a saloon door by a man twice her size. She was holding papers against her chest with her free arm, pressed flat against her body, with the grip of someone who has decided that whatever else happens, those papers do not leave her hands. Cole brought her to the bar and said something to her that James could not hear from the corner table, and the woman said something back, and Cole's face changed into the expression that faces change into when they have been told no and are deciding what to do about no. 30 men in the saloon registered all of this and made their calculations and settled deeper into their chairs and their conversations and their drinks. James watched and waited one more second to be sure of what he was seeing, and then he was sure. Cole grabbed her arm harder, and she pulled back with the specific resistance of someone who is not going to be moved, regardless of what the size differential suggests about the outcome. She did not look frightened. She looked decided. The expression of a person who made their decision before they left home that morning and is not going to unmake it because the situation has become difficult. Because the situation being difficult was always part of what they prepared for. Cole raised his hand. James stood up. He did not push back his chair loudly. He did not announce himself. He simply stood up from the corner table and walked toward the bar with the unhurried pace of a man who has already decided where this is going and does not need to hurry to get there. He stopped 6 feet from Cole and said one sentence. He said, "Take your hand off her." Cole turned and looked at him with the assessment of a man who is deciding whether what has just appeared in front of him is a problem. He said, "Sit down, friend. This is government business." James said, "I know what government business looks like. This is not it." Cole's jaw tightened. He said, "Walk away. before this becomes your problem too. James looked at him steadily. He said, "It already is." Then James did something that changed the temperature of the room in a way that nobody present had expected, and that James had not planned, but that came from the same place that most useful things came from in his experience. The accumulated information of years, applied to an immediate situation without ceremony. He looked at the woman, and he spoke to her in Apache. His Apache was not fluent. It had never been fluent. It was the working knowledge of a man who had spent 6 years in communities where Apache was the primary language and had learned enough to be useful and respectful and understood. He asked her in Apache if she was hurt. It was a simple sentence, accented, probably imperfect, but it was Apache, and it landed in that saloon the way a stone lands in still water, the ripple going out from the center in every direction simultaneously. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something happens that none of the people in the room had prepared a response for. Cole's confidence shifted, not disappeared. Men like Cole did not lose confidence easily, but shifted, the recalibration of someone who has just encountered a variable that was not in the calculation he started with. The woman looked at James. Something in her expression changed, not relief, not yet, but the specific adjustment of someone who has been alone in a hostile situation and has just discovered that the situation is slightly less completely hostile than it was a moment ago. She said in English, "I am not hurt." James nodded once. He looked at Cole and said, "Her name and her nation are her own business. What she took from the county office, she had the legal right to access. Territorial citizens have access to public land records. That is the law." Cole said, "She is not a territorial citizen." James said, "The Territorial Citizenship Act of 1873 extended citizenship to all permanent residents regardless of origin. You can look it up." He said it with the flat certainty of a man who has read the act and is not bluffing about it, which he was not. He had read it 4 years ago when he filed his formal objection to a relocation operation and had cited it in the objection and had been overruled anyway, but that was a different situation and a different day. Cole looked at him. He said, "Who are you?" James told him. "Former U.S. Army scout, 6 years in New Mexico and Arizona territories." He said his name. Cole heard the name, and something moved behind his eyes. Not recognition exactly, more like the awareness that he had just encountered a name he should probably report to Wrath before he made any further decisions in this saloon. Cole stepped back. He did not do it dramatically. He simply stepped back and straightened his coat and looked at the woman one more time with the expression of a man marking something for later rather than abandoning it, and walked out of the saloon without further conversation. The room let out the breath it had been holding in the way rooms do when a thing that was building toward a conclusion has been redirected. James looked at the woman. She was still holding the papers against her chest, still standing at the bar with the posture of someone who had not yet fully processed that the immediate danger had passed. She looked at him and said, "You speak our language." James said, "Enough to know you came a long way for something important." She said, "My people have 30 days. 30 days before they move us off land our families have lived on for 3 generations. James said, "Show me what you found." They walked out of the saloon together and down the main street to the livery at the far end, where the horses were, and the noise of the saloon did not reach, and she opened the papers she had been holding against her chest since the county office, and laid them on the livery's workbench in the afternoon light. James read them without speaking. He read them the way he read things when the reading mattered, completely, twice, the second time slower than the first. Then he went still in the specific way of someone who has just understood something that changes the shape of everything around it. He looked up at her. He said, "Do you know what this does to Edmund Wrath?" She said, "It proves his survey was a forgery." James looked at the document and looked at her and said, "It does more than that. This unravels 8 years of his work. He knows you have it. And he will not send Cole back alone." The original survey was dated March 1861 and had the specific physical quality of a document that was 18 years old rather than a document made to look 18 years old. The paper had the particular yellowing that comes from time rather than treatment. The ink had faded in the uneven way that ink fades when it has been exposed to varying light and humidity across nearly 2 decades. and the notation style used the surveying conventions of the early territorial period that James recognized from his years of working alongside land records in the Army. He had seen enough genuine 1861 surveys and enough forged ones to know the difference without having to think carefully about it, the way a man who has handled enough currency knows a counterfeit bill by the feel before he looks at the printing. Rath's 1878 filing claimed to be based on an 1861 survey that included the Apache settlement land in the territorial sale records. The document Nady had taken from the county office was the actual 1861 survey. It showed the Apache settlement land explicitly excluded, the boundary line drawn around it, a notation in the margin in the surveyor's hand that read exempt by order of the territorial commissioner, the same notation that appeared on 3 other parcels excluded from the sale for various reasons. The 2 surveys described the same territory in the same year and arrived at opposite conclusions about the same piece of land. One of them was what it claimed to be, the other was not. James had known which one within 30 seconds of reading both. He took another 2 minutes to confirm what he already knew, and then set the documents on the workbench and looked at Nady. He explained it the way he had learned to explain technical evidence to people who needed to act on it rather than just understand it. Not the full complexity, but the specific things that would matter when the documents were reviewed by someone with authority. The notation style was the clearest marker. The surveying conventions Rath had used in his supposedly 1861 document reflected practices that had not been standardized until 1869. James had seen the standardization happen during his Army years and remembered it specifically because it had changed the way land disputes were documented, and he had had to learn the new conventions while still working with documents produced under the old ones. A man forging an 1861 document in 1878 would use the conventions he knew, which were the 1869 conventions, because the 1861 conventions were not what a 1878 forger's hands remembered. Nadia listened to all of this with the focused attention of someone who came 30 miles for exactly this kind of information, and is not going to miss any of it. She said, "My father knew the survey was wrong. He studied the maps the government produced, and they did not match what Rath filed. He did not know the specific language to prove it." James said, "Your father was right about everything. This document proves it. But proof that stays in this livery proves nothing. We need to get it to someone Rath cannot reach." James told her about Commissioner Ward's wagons. He described Ward the way he had heard him described by men in the land office who had worked under him. Not praised exactly, because Ward was not a man who generated warmth, but respected in the specific way that people respect someone whose consistency you can rely on even when it is inconvenient. Ward did not make decisions based on who was presenting the case. He made them based on what the documents showed when read correctly by someone who had spent 30 years reading them. He was 2 miles east of Harrow on a routine inspection tour that had nothing to do with Apache land or Rath's filing or any of this, which was the best possible circumstance. A federal official with the authority to act on what he saw, present in the territory by coincidence rather than by arrangement, which meant Rath had not had the opportunity to prepare him or compromise him or do any of the things Rath did to the people he needed to manage. James said, "You ride east. You find Ward's camp before he breaks it and moves on. You show him both surveys, and you tell him exactly what I told you about the notation style. He will see it. He has been reading surveys longer than either of us has been alive." Nadia looked at him. She said, "And you?" James said, "I stay here and make enough official noise that Rath has to respond through his office rather than through Cole. Official responses take time. Time is what you need." She looked at him for a moment longer, with the expression of someone evaluating whether to trust a plan that depends on another person doing their part correctly. Then she said, "How much time do I need?" James said, 2 hours if Ward is still in camp." Nadia nodded once and began folding the survey document back into the careful fold it had arrived in. Before this story goes any further, drop a comment right now and tell me, if you had been Nady in that livery, 30 miles from home with your entire community's future in your hands, would you have trusted the plan? Would you have trusted James? No judgment here. Because what Nadia decides in the next 30 seconds is the difference between 30 families keeping their land and losing it forever. The livery door opened before Nadia finished folding the document. She went still, the way a person goes still when they have been in danger before, and their body has learned to stop moving before their mind has finished processing the sound. James turned. The man who came through the door was not Cole. He was smaller than Cole, better dressed, moving with the composed deliberateness of someone who does not need size to communicate authority because he has something that works better than size. He was somewhere in his 50s with the kind of face that had learned to reveal nothing without effort, and now revealed nothing naturally. The practiced neutrality of a man who had spent 8 years making decisions that other people bore the consequences of, and had long since stopped registering those consequences in his expression. He was wearing the coat of a territorial land agent, the official identification visible at the lapel, and he carried a leather folder the same way Nady had carried the survey document, pressed against his body, the grip of someone who understands that what they are carrying has value. His name was Edmund Rath, and James knew it before Rath said anything, because the coat and the identification and the composed authority and the timing all assembled themselves into one conclusion, and the conclusion had a name. Rath looked at Nady. He looked at the document in her hands. He looked at James. He said, "I am glad I found you both together. It will save time." He opened the leather folder and produced a document and held it out. He said, "I have a federal warrant for the arrest of this woman for theft of government documents from the county office of Harrow, New Mexico Territory." James took the warrant. He read it the way he had read the survey, completely, without expression, giving each line the attention it required. It was real. The territorial judge's signature was genuine. James had seen that signature on enough documents during his Army years to recognize it without needing to compare it to anything. The legal language was correct. The charge was accurate in its narrow technical sense. Nady had taken a document from the county office without the county clerk's authorization, which was the definition of what the warrant said it was, regardless of the fact that the document she had taken was a public record she had a legal right to access, and that the reason the clerk had not authorized the access was that the clerk was in Rath's pocket. James looked at the warrant and understood the architecture of what Rath had built in the time between Cole walking out of the saloon and Rath walking into the livery. He had gone directly to the judge. He had produced the warrant. He had come himself rather than sending Cole, because coming himself was the official move, and Rath always made the official move when the official move was available. If James handed Nady over, the document went into custody with her. In custody, it went to the county office. In the county office, it went to Rath. And Rath would make it disappear, the way he had made every other inconvenient document disappear across 8 years of careful official fraud. Not destroyed, because destroying official records was a crime even Rath did not risk, but misfiled, reclassified, buried in a location that required official authorization to access, and where official authorization would never be granted. The only document that could save 30 Apache families from losing land their grandparents had lived on was about to become the instrument of their permanent removal, and James looked at Edmund Rath across the livery and understood that the trap was complete and legal, and that Rath had built it in under an hour, which meant he had been thinking about this contingency before today, which meant he was considerably more dangerous than Cole had suggested. James did not move toward Nady, and he did not move toward the door, and he did not reach for anything at his belt. He stood in the livery with the warrant in his hand and looked at Edmund Rath and asked one question. He said, "Under what authority does a territorial land agent execute a federal arrest warrant?" He asked it in the specific measured tone of someone who already knows the answer, and is asking because the answer needs to exist in the air between them, where other people can hear it. Rath looked at him with the assessment of a man recalibrating. He said, "I have the authority of my office." James said, "Your office authorizes land surveying and registration under the Territorial Land Act of 1866. Arrest authority under a federal warrant requires a federal marshal or an officer specifically deputized for that purpose by a federal court." He paused. "Are you a deputized officer, Mr. Rath?" Rath's lawyer, who had come in behind Rath and had been standing near the door, with the expression of a man who is present in a professional capacity and would prefer not to be present in any other, started to answer. James said, "I am asking Mr. Rath." The lawyer closed his mouth. Rath looked at James with the controlled anger of a man who is too experienced to make the mistake being offered to him, and too proud to enjoy not making it. He said, "The marshal will be here within the hour." James said, "Then we will wait for the marshal." Rath held his gaze for a moment. Then he and his lawyer went outside to send the message. The livery door closed behind them. James looked at Nadie. He said, "1 hour." She was already moving toward her horse. She went out the back of the livery. There was a rear entrance that opened onto the alley behind the main street, the kind of exit that liveries always had for practical reasons, and that James had noted when they came in, because noting exits was the same muscle as noting the commissioner's wagons. The same habit that had been running quietly underneath everything else since he rode into Harrow that morning. He watched her go, and then he went out the front and onto the main street of Harrow and began doing the thing he had told her he would do. He went to the county office first. He presented himself at the clerk's desk and formally registered a dispute regarding the access rights that had led to Nadie's warrant. Specifically, whether an Apache woman with territorial residency had the legal right to access public land survey records, and whether the county clerk's refusal of that access had been properly authorized under the county access protocols. The clerk looked at him. James said, "I need that dispute registered in the official record. Today." The clerk, who was not a brave man, but was a man who understood that not registering a formally submitted dispute created its own official problem, registered it. James then requested copies of the county access log for the previous 2 weeks. The clerk said that would take time to produce. James said, "I will wait." He waited in the county office for 22 minutes while the clerk produced the access log, which the clerk did slowly, for reasons that had nothing to do with the complexity of the task. James accepted the copies and thanked the clerk and went back to the street and submitted a formal request at the county administrator's office for a review of the original warrant filing. Specifically, whether the territorial judge's authorization had included proper review of the access rights dispute now on record. Each request was legitimate. Each one required a written response from someone with the authority to provide it. Each response took time. James was not doing this quickly. He was doing it at exactly the pace that legitimate process required. Not faster, not slower. The pace that a man uses when he is not trying to avoid anything, but is simply making sure that every step is done correctly, and the record reflects that every step was done correctly. Rath appeared on the street at the 40-minute mark. He had been watching from somewhere and had realized what James was doing, and his controlled anger had become something quieter and more dangerous. The specific fury of a man who cannot openly object to legitimate process without exposing the reason he wants to rush it, which is that the reason does not survive exposure. He said, "You are obstructing a federal warrant." James said, "I am exercising my right to register a formal dispute and request documentary review. Both of those are legal." Rath said nothing else. He went back to wherever he had been watching from. The marshal arrived at the 58-minute mark. He was a man in his 40s named Briggs, who had the look of someone who does his job without enthusiasm and without negligence, the professional median of a man who has been enforcing federal warrants long enough to have stopped having opinions about the specific circumstances of each one. He found James on the main street and showed his identification and said, "I have a warrant for the arrest of an Apache woman named Nadie. Where is she?" James said, "I do not know her current location." The marshal looked at him with the expression of a man receiving an answer he expected and does not find satisfying. He said, "That is an interesting response from a man who was seen leaving the livery with her less than 2 hours ago." James said, "People move." The marshal said, "Mr. Calloway, if you are obstructing the execution of a federal warrant, that is a serious charge that I am authorized to act on immediately." James looked at him steadily. He said, "I am aware of that." He said nothing else. He was not going to say anything else. There was nothing else that helped, and he knew it, and the marshal knew he knew it. And they stood on the main street of Harrow in the afternoon light and waited in the specific silence of two men who are both waiting for the same thing from different sides of it, and neither of whom can make it arrive faster by talking about it. The rider came from the east at a pace that told James what he needed to know before the rider reached the main street. A man riding hard from the direction of a federal commissioner's camp in the afternoon of a day when things were in motion was not riding with bad news. Bad news came slower. with the heaviness of something the rider did not want to deliver. This rider was moving with the urgency of someone carrying something that needs to arrive before circumstances change, which was a different quality entirely, and James read it from 50 yards the way he had learned to read riders from distances where most people only saw dust. The rider pulled up in front of the marshal and produced a document from his coat, and the marshal took it and read it. And James watched the marshal's face complete the reading and arrive at whatever the document said, and then watched the marshal look at Wrath. Wrath was standing to the marshal's left. He looked at the document in the marshal's hand with the expression of a man who has not yet been shown what it contains, but has correctly identified from the marshal's face and the rider's direction that it contains something he did not plan for. The marshal handed it to him without speaking. Wrath read it. What happened in his face was not dramatic. He was too controlled for dramatic, but something went out of it. The specific light that a man carries when he believes he is holding all the relevant information, and which disappears when he discovers he was wrong about what the relevant information was. It was a federal stay order signed by Commissioner Aldous Ward, acting in his capacity as a senior official of the Federal Land Office on inspection tour in New Mexico Territory. It stayed the Apache relocation order effective immediately, pending investigation of conflicting land surveys filed for the same territory in 1861 and 1878. It directed the Territorial Marshal's Office to preserve all relevant documents pending federal review. It suspended Edmund Wrath from his duties as Territorial Land Agent pending the outcome of that review. And it noted, in the specific dry language of federal orders, that the investigation had been initiated based on documentary evidence presented by a territorial resident in the course of a formal complaint, which was the language that described Nady riding 2 miles east with an 18-year-old survey and presenting it to a man who had spent 30 years knowing what surveys looked like when they were what they claimed to be and when they were not. The marshal read the stay order a second time. Then he looked at the warrant in his other hand. Then he looked at Wrath. He said, "The arrest warrant is suspended pending federal review." Wrath said, "That order does not have the authority to suspend a warrant signed by a territorial judge." The marshal said, "Commissioner Ward's federal authority supersedes territorial judicial authority in matters under Federal Land Office jurisdiction." He said it without satisfaction, not just fact. Wrath said nothing. The marshal folded the warrant and put it in his coat. He looked at James. He said, "She reached him." James said, "She rode hard." The marshal looked at Wrath one more time. He said, "Mr. Wrath, you are suspended from your duties effective immediately. Please do not leave the territory pending federal review." Nadia rode back into Harrow that evening as the light was going off the high desert in the way it goes in New Mexico. Not gradually, but in stages. The color changing through gold and rose, and then the specific blue that comes before dark. The sky doing something that made the flat country look briefly like somewhere that understood its own beauty. James was at the boarding house when she came, and they sat at the table in the front room while she told him what Ward had said, which was more than the stay order contained and less than the investigation would eventually find. Ward had looked at the 2 surveys for 10 minutes and had said to Nady in the specific flat language of a man who has been doing this long enough that certainty does not require decoration. "This one is genuine and this one is not, and I have been doing this long enough to know the difference by the paper." James listened to all of it. He asked one question. He said, "When does the stay expire?" Nady said, "It does not expire. It holds until the federal investigation concludes." James nodded once. That was the answer that mattered. Everything else was process, and process would take the time it took, but it would take it from a position that Wrath could not move, and that was enough. He loaded his horse the following morning, while the town was still deciding what kind of day it was going to be. Nadia came to the livery. She stood in the entrance with the morning light behind her and said, "My father will want to know your name." James said, "He does not need my name. He needs the document to stay safe until the investigation finishes." Nadia said, "It will." Then she said, "Why did you stand up in that saloon?" "You did not know me." James checked the girth strap and checked it again. Not because it needed checking twice, but because it was something to do with his hands while he found the right words, which he was not always good at finding. He put his foot in the stirrup. He said, "I knew enough." He settled into the saddle and gathered the reins and looked at Natty once, and then at the road west, and rode out of the livery into the Harrow morning. 2 miles out, a rider came up behind him from the direction of town. Young, Apache, maybe 17, moving fast on a horse that knew the country. The rider came alongside and handed James a folded piece of paper without speaking, and peeled away and was gone back east before James had finished opening it. 3 words in Apache, written in a hand he did not recognize. He read them once. He did not need to read them again. They meant, "We remember you." James held the paper for a moment in the morning air, with the high desert stretching out in every direction, and the road west ahead of him, and the road east behind him, where Harrow was, and where 30 miles further west the Apache community was still on the land their grandparents had lived on, because a young woman had ridden 30 miles alone and had not let go of a document, regardless of what it cost her to hold it. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his coat pocket against his chest and rode on. Something in the way he sat the saddle was different from the way he had ridden into Harrow the day before. Not visible exactly, not something anyone watching from the road would have been able to name, but real the way things are real when they happen inside a person, rather than outside them. The specific adjustment of a man who has been carrying something at a wrong angle for 4 years and has just found the position where it finally sits level. If this story stayed with you, if Nadi holding that document against her chest through everything that happened meant something, if 3 words on a folded piece of paper felt like the right ending for a man who had been carrying the wrong angle for 4 years, subscribe now. Because this channel exists to tell the stories that did not make it into the official record. The nadies who rode 30 miles alone for their people. The fathers who sent their daughters because the daughters could do it. The James Callaways who stood up in saloons because what they were looking at had a name, and the name required a response, regardless of who else in the room had decided it did not. Those people were real. They are still real. And every week this channel finds another one and tells their story the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe, hit the bell, and we will see you next week.